Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hillary. This is a special bonus episode of the podcast because of the novel coronavirus COVID-19 outbreak. I pulled together a few different analysts from around the world to see what's been going on in their region and what are the companies that they're talking to thinking about at present. You're going to hear a discussion featuring Peter Ryan from Canada, Steve Loynd from the US, and Rod Jones from South Africa.
Well, a very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone who has taken the time to download this special edition of the CX Files. My name is Peter Ryan, and I'm the Principal Analyst at Ryan Strategic Advisory. I'm based in Montreal, Quebec, in the heartland of Canada. We've decided that we really needed to do some type of a podcast or some type of a discussion around what's going on related to the COVID-19 pandemic that appears to be sweeping the world right now. I'm very fortunate enough to have been asked to host this episode of the CX Files, notwithstanding the grave nature of what the industry is going through right now and really what the health of the world is going through. But I'm also fortunate enough to be able to have a discussion with three of the utmost professionals in customer experience analysis and advisory who I've assembled with me today on the telephone. I'm very delighted to introduce to everybody, no stranger to the CX Files podcast. From Johannesburg, South Africa, we have Rod Jones, who has been a legend and continues to be a legend in contact center advisory, around operations, around marketing, around management, within the scope not just of South Africa, but the entire African continent, the Middle East, and growing his footprint into different parts of the world as well. From Trendzowl, we have Stephen Loynd, who is probably in North America the utmost futurist when it comes to the delivery of customer experience and contact center services. And turning the tables a little bit, who will be answering the questions on this episode of the CX Files, as opposed to asking them, Mark Hillary from Carnaby Content, who, again, is probably, I'd say, one of the foremost experts when it comes to customer experience management and delivery globally. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for taking the time out of what I think is a very busy schedule for all of us to have a discussion, a frank discussion, in terms of where the industry is going as it relates to COVID-19 right now. What we'll do is we'll start by setting the stage, and we're going to have a pretty quick discussion, I think, here, but a very fruitful one when it comes to what's going on with regards to the impact of customer experience that the COVID-19 virus is having as it stands. We've seen the equity markets melt down over the course of the past couple of weeks. We have seen a significant drop in both consumer and business confidence. And looking at the economy and looking at the impact on customer experience, Rod, if I could start with you, what in your opinion is going to be the impact when it comes to consumer consumption, when it comes to the demand for different products and services over the course of the next, say, 6 to 12 weeks? And what should contact center professionals be expecting over the course of this period as well?
Well, thank you very much for that, Peter. Yes, during the course of today, and it's for us late evening now, I have been engaging with several principals of BPO and operators throughout South Africa, and it's some really interesting facts starting to emerge. And in the terms of consumer services, a company that I engaged with this morning, Digital Solutions Group, who handle and they've asked me not to mention the brand, a global brand on home delivery, essentially, of foodstuffs or fast foods. What they've actually experienced over the last few days, despite the fact that on Sunday, our president announced far-reaching implications of basically a national shutdown, schools, daycare centers, etc., universities, and more and more people are doing the self-isolation, stay at home. The traffic reports this morning reported the main arterial roads to be more like a Sunday morning. So the country is taking it very seriously. But back to the home delivery of fast foods. The company was anticipating an upsurge in requests for home deliveries. However, the converse has happened. It's dropped down to about 25% of previous volumes. So there's a strange situation evolving in that situation that we don't really know why. Is it because people are locked down and therefore careful of spend? Are we mistrusting the actual people who are going to be delivering the home delivery food? So it's a very strange situation that's evolved, and we really don't know the answers to that, and probably won't for a week or so.
It's very, very true, Rod. There are a lot of things that we just don't know how they're going to pan out over the course of the coming weeks. Steve, I'd be curious to get from your standpoint, your thoughts when it comes to how consumer demand, how the expectation of consumers to be taking up things such as home delivery or different products and services is likely to evolve over the course of the next 1 to 2 months. I seem to recall, Steve, you and I were both at an industry analyst event around the time that the global financial crisis was hitting. In fact, I think it was the very day that the stock market started to fall apart. We were witnessing this I believe it was in the Midwest of the United States, and we were all very, very taken aback by the extent to which things were happening so quickly. Things have happened quickly in this situation as well. Are there lessons that can be learned from how the consumer economy fell apart just over a decade ago that can be applied today as it relates to customer experience management?
Great series of questions, Peter, and thank you for having me. The first thing I'd say is that I think obviously we're in a very serious situation. We've had a supply chain a crisis across the world, specifically in China. We now have a demand crisis as well. That's cascading because of the pandemic into the labor markets. You've seen developments in the oil markets, the bond market, all of these confusing signals, and of course the stock market. And for our purposes, if you look at some of the publicly traded BPOs, look at what's going on with their stocks. Some of them are being hammered, to say the least. And so in the short term that you reference, this is a very serious situation. And the more you read and absorb some very bright viewpoints out there, one must, consider the possibility that this thing is going to go on for many months. And that, I would err conservatively on this thing. I think it's a very serious situation now. On your second point, over a decade ago during the financial crisis, what I find curious today is I do sense there's a lot of scrambling obviously going on with a lot of BPOs out there. And I feel like, there were lessons learned during the period that you just mentioned in the early to mid 2000s. If you remember the sort of the build up to the housing crisis, and we talked about this at the time, Americans were experiencing significant economic stress back then. And I mean, in the early, again, to the mid 2000s. And the housing headwinds, if you will, that started to hit the economy at that time occurred at a time when U.S. workers, wage earners, already faced significant challenges to both their wallets and their productivity. So this is why I was at IDC at the time. We were putting out research talking about this in the context of BPO. Big prices for big ticket items such as housing, transportation, healthcare. That's all over the conversation today. College education, everything was skyrocketing except for workers' wages. And so it was in that context that I was writing a lot about the home-based agent model and urging companies, enterprises, and their BPO partners to take a hard look at it. And here's a final interesting point that a lot of people don't remember. But in 2006, the White House back then, they actually put out a report on a pandemic flu scenario. And they described a sobering scenario of social and economic displacement that would buffet the U.S. should there be a serious outbreak. And that, at the time, you remember bird flu was the concern, the virus in Asia. And that was the pretext for the White House report on what people and enterprises should do. But the report proposed that there should be immediate implementation of telecommuting, and that people should avoid shaking hands and stay, I think it was about 3 feet distance. But I was writing about this at IDC at the time, home shoring's place in imperfect world. And so I guess my point here is, number one, we should have been thinking about this for a long time. And this situation today, to kind of revert to my initial point, I think it's much more serious than that earlier instance, which was more of a financial and a stock market issue. I think this is going to cascade in more profound ways, and hopefully we're going to persevere through it, and BPOs will deploy this model in a way that makes sense.
Absolutely, Stephen. Thank you very much for those thoughts. Mark, I'm going to throw the floor to you now. I'd be very curious if you could give us a sense from what you've been picking up in your interactions with enterprises and with your BPO clients as well. If there's any anticipation about which industries, which verticals are going to likely see a spike in demand for outsourced contact center services or customer experience delivery, and those that might see a bit of a trough over the course of the coming weeks.
Yeah, okay. I've been talking to a lot of the companies and clients that I work with, and to be honest, I haven't heard from any of them in those terms, like in terms of specific verticals that are suffering right now. And I think that's probably because we're just seeing this across the board. Once you see regions going into a total lockdown and people are not even allowed to leave their own home, then the only way a company can be resilient in that environment is if it's professional services and everything can be delivered online. So we're seeing a serious problem for companies across all industries. Certainly every company on the CX side, the CX providers, everybody is talking about work-at-home agents. They've been talking about it for years, but I think that now we're seeing this sudden cultural shift. People are being forced to consider it, whereas previously they may have only considered it as part of a business continuity strategy. So that's the biggest change that's happening right now. Is everybody is suggesting that you need to get some of your team out of the contact center as quickly as possible. Because if you see what's happened in the Philippines, where they went into lockdown, it then becomes extremely difficult to get people into work.
Yes, very true, very true. And on that note, I think that one of the biggest elements that contact center companies, whether it's in-house or outsourced, are thinking about right now, the executives are really considering how best to keep the health of their agents paramount, how to keep that front and center. Obviously, we are a group of people who we're privileged enough to travel the world. We're privileged enough to get to know contact center executives and agents in all 4 corners of the globe. Rod, starting with you, can you give me a flavor about what's going on from the perspective of Africa? And I'm saying this knowing that you spoke at the Zimbabwe Contact Center Association general meeting over the course of the last couple of days. Maybe starting with Zimbabwe and moving to South Africa, if you can give some flavor to what's going on there in order to keep the health risks as low as possible in contact center delivery.
Right, thank you very much, Peter. Yes, I arrived in Zimbabwe on Sunday and spent Monday, Tuesday running a seminar with around about 40 delegates representing top end of corporate. And of course, corona and the virus pandemic was top of mind there. Sadly, I do have to report that there's very little activity. There is awareness, but other than the odd bottles of hand sanitizer being passed around and a lot of jokes being made about the elbow touch greeting, it was not top. It didn't seem to be top of mind. The operators there, when I started discussing and asking questions about contingency plans, etc., there was virtually no. We haven't even thought about it because we haven't been touched by it yet. And so sadly, I think Zimbabwe might well take a heavy hit by not being prepared. Secondly, I was told by authorities that there simply doesn't have the medical infrastructure, the testing infrastructure, the hospitals to actually handle testing. So the fact that Zimbabwe is reporting a 0 incidence of corona is probably because they just don't have the testing facilities. So sadly, although Zimbabwe, I believe, is poised in better times to take on massive volumes of BPO due to the fact that they have high levels of education, beautiful speaking voices, 90% unemployment, and therefore tens of thousands of graduates. So everything is there except this preparedness for corona. So, that's the sad reality of Zimbabwe. On the other hand, I was able to facilitate yesterday, in the space of several hours, that's all, the diversion of some fairly high volume out of Australia that was formerly going to Philippines. As of today, we should see some of those calls, quite a lot of those calls, diverted to a 200-seat facility based in Zimbabwe. So that's maybe one of the upsides in terms of the industry in Zimbabwe. So that's the Zimbabwe. In South Africa, yes, I've been calling around today. I think the most positive feedback that I get is from our national body, BAPESA. I was lucky enough to spend about 45 minutes on the telephone with the CEO, Andy Searle, who gave me the high level of what has actually happened in probably a little over a week. The implementation of regional crisis committees, 3 times a week, coordination, virtual meetings with those regional bodies and teams, high-level involvement by the major BPO players. At this time, it's all about protecting the well-being and the health of agents. That's where the focus is. And so there's a mad scramble to get sanitization into place, ring fencing certain areas possible of the contact centers, restricting movement. The tragedy of our work, our environment in South Africa is that a large percentage of our 250,000 agents live in semi-formal and informal housing, where it's high density, and in fact many of those areas don't even have running water, so just forget about the wash the hands every half hour. And so the inability to send work home is a reality in our space. So the fear is that not if, but when corona hits some of our bigger BPO operators, it's going to be really difficult to continue servicing.
Thanks, Rod. Steve, in your opinion, what do contact center operators need to do within their bricks and mortar facilities in order to better guarantee the integrity, the health integrity of their agents and the sanitary nature of the facilities themselves? Do you have any thoughts on that, or anything you've been picking up based on your discussions with outsourcers or enterprise contact center operators?
Yeah, you can imagine, Peter, that right now, to Rod's point, think about globally, all around the world, some of the big BPOs, or all of them, are probably having intense conversations with government officials about the state of their contact centers and, the steps that they need to be taking. As Rod said, things like sanitization and ring fencing, et cetera, and having real processes in place within those centers. The scenario that Rod left us with there, of course, the great fear is that there's a breakout within a center, and then you've got a whole new situation. So the top BPOs are going to have to be exhibiting great discipline and great agility, themes that we've been talking about over the years, but that have taken on new urgency in new ways. And so hopefully that's what's happening out there. I'm sure we'll learn more as time goes on, but discipline and agility and real leadership skills are going to separate some of the contact center providers out there these days.
Very much so. And it's interesting to note that I've picked up on LinkedIn the past few days. There's been some really good assessments in regards to what individual companies are doing, and I'll just call out a few. This morning, Emerge BPO published a blog outlining the steps they're taking to make their contact centers in Guyana safer. A Redial BPO last night published best practices in terms of what they have been up to as a means of keeping their contact centers in Tijuana sanitary and healthy for their agents. I noticed as well that ITEL BPO has made a similar publication. So certainly there's a lot of activity going on by what I would say some of the most important outsourcers in the American nearshore are doing. Mark, have you heard of anything going on in the context of where you're based in Brazil or in South America with regards to how best practices are being managed, as we do know that the coronavirus is sweeping through a number of countries within that region?
Yeah, in fact, I mean, after this call, I'm going to be recording a conversation with the Chief Customer Officer at 5CA, which is a Netherlands-based CX specialist. And they're quite interesting because they were formed in the 90s, so over 20 years ago, and they were always formed to be majority work at home. So they have a couple of decades experience making work at home work. And right now, about 95% of their workforce is based at home. And they're basically putting out a call to say that they're willing to share their expertise with anybody, like anybody who's trying to get work at home actually functioning overnight is clearly going to make a lot of mistakes. So, you know, they're sort of offering their expertise, and you can just reach out to them on LinkedIn. But I think that the bottom line here is, as Steve was saying, there's been a general lack of agility within the marketplace. People have not explored the requirement to really manage business continuity to the extent that people just haven't planned for a pandemic. They've explored scenarios such as losing power at the office, or losing public transport, or even a terrorist incident. But nobody has really sort of considered what happens if 60% of your staff can't even get to work. And I think that this is why the CX companies are really pushing very hard on work-at-home agents. And the companies that are hiring them to manage their customer service, they need to be doing this as fast as possible, because I don't believe that this is a problem that's going to be fixed and finished in a couple of weeks. Many of the scientists are suggesting that if countries don't really enact tough policies and go into total lockdown, then you could be looking at a year of disruption. So it's really worth calling up your service provider now and seeing how much you can transition to work at home.
And I think that work at home is a great place to finish off the podcast. I'd like to start with you, Rod, and finish off with you, Mark. Steve, if you could follow on from Rod, if you could give maybe a 1 to 2 minute conclusion in regards to what you feel needs to be done, whether it's deploying work at home or increasing work at home capacity, and how best to do so. What should customer experience operators, whether it's in-house or outsourced, be focusing on now in order to ensure the best business continuity possible?
Right, thank you, Peter. And I think, as Mark said, and I reiterate that the focus probably for the next 3-4 weeks, or maybe even longer than that, has to be on the security of the workforce in the working environment. Particularly in our instance, or in our case, where the logistics just do not favor high volume work from home. So everything will be focused in our region on protecting the workforce and sanitization. And then, of course, the discussion this morning with one of the operators who's well into the scenario of not if, but the when it strikes the contact center. How do you move a group of agents or even our entire operation off-site in order to do a thorough, in-depth sanitization and then fire it up again? So my view on this is that, yes, there's possibly too little, too late thought into remote and off-site working. There's too little thought gone into the disaster recovery strategies for this type of situation. And as I said, thirdly, we don't have the right working environment and the social environment that is conducive to home-based agents. So the prognosis for our environment is not too cheerful. As Stephen said, we're probably into this for at least a year.
Thank you, Rod. Some very pragmatic and I think realistic comments. Steve, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would echo Rod's point about not if, but when. Sit down with your leadership team and plan for when it happens and how you have to react to a contact center that has been compromised, so to speak, by the virus and what you're going to do. That leads to my point. If I were sitting there thinking about this, I would say, just worst case it. Sit down with your team and assume, for example, and I agree with what Mark said a couple of minutes ago, which is this thing's going to go on. Everything that I've been reading from some really good sources, I think that companies and providers should be planning for a year and a half. Start with that. Worst case, what are we going to have to do if this scenario ripples and comes back, and there are advances and then pullbacks and then difficulties over the next year and a half? And what is our organization going to have to do to make that happen? Again, to be as agile and disciplined, as smart as you can be. And then my quick other point also echoes what Mark said. Get in touch with organizations that have used the work-at-home model, that understand how to get it running quickly and have made the mistakes so that they might be able to help you. Think about who you can talk to at those organizations, and that's a great place to start. So worst case it, a year and a half, and then who can you talk to get knowledge transfer? And then the final quick point I'd make, guys, is obviously the work-at-home model does not work under certain scenarios, and there are some sensitive workflows, and there are some infrastructure issues in different parts of the world, cybersecurity, et cetera, connectivity. But nonetheless, be thinking hard how you might creatively approach this challenge.
Thanks, Steve. Mark, I'll let you, our gracious host, finish up just in terms of any thoughts you might have before we terminate the podcast.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I think that this point that Steve's making is really one of the most important. This is not going to be over in weeks. Look at your existing operation and think about how are you going to be doing this in a year and a half if you're still disrupted. I think in terms of the CX supplier companies, they need to be ramping up their hiring for work-at-home agents. They need to be planning how to onboard a much larger number of people than normal. How do you train them? How do you get them up to speed? And I think that definitely we're going to see an enormous boost in the work-at-home agent model in the immediate future. But one of the problems is that the culture of work actually changes as well. You need to change the way you manage people who are working from home. So the managers need coaching. Your managers may need even to be changed. You need to work out different ways of recognizing team members, and actually, so there's going to be a cultural shift as well that's required in a lot of organizations, and I think that's going to be difficult for some companies.
Gentlemen, as always, it's great catching up with each one of you, especially collectively, to discuss what's going on in our industry, albeit today was very sobering and I think very realistic in regards to where the industry is headed, what measures need to be taken, and how best these measures can be deployed and implemented. I'd like to thank all of you for taking part. I'd like to thank our audience for listening. If anybody has any questions for Mark, for Rod, or for Steve, please feel free to get in touch with Mark on the CX Files website. I believe that there is a link in regards to be able to connect directly with him and throw your questions over. We'd all be happy to take them on. In the meantime, can I just wish everybody in the industry and their families the best possible luck to stay healthy and to get through this global crisis. We're all in this together, and certainly from the standpoint of the industry, we will get through it. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. Please take a moment to review the podcast because this helps other listeners to find it. And if you have any suggestions, then get in touch with me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm at Mark Hillary with 2 L's, or just search Google for Mark Hillary.